This process has been so overwhelming, and surprisingly, AI has made this so much harder than you would think. I'm gonna talk through the apartment hunting process, which is super exciting on one hand, but super overwhelming on the other, especially just doing this like kind of by myself. It's been quite a whirlwind. I just wrapped up my very last tour, and I didn't really record like while I was doing it. I took little clips on my phone so I can show you certain things of what like won't work for me, what will work for me. And I didn't want to record while different, people from the leasing offices were giving me tours. I didn't want to be rude or that person. So I really want to just talk about what I kind of like went in thinking I wanted. And now that I've toured so many places, I now feel like what I want is completely different from what I initially started out with. So it's been an exhausting couple of days, to say the least. Within 3 days, I toured around 25 places. And that's because like when I started this process, I really was looking for something that the more I saw what I was originally wanting, I realized that's just not gonna work for me. And I'll talk about AI and why it has made this process so much more challenging, specifically as someone with a disability looking for certain accessibility needs where I'm living. It has just been such a pain in the booty. And basically that's because, like, as I'm sure some of you are aware, a lot of different industries are shifting towards using AI or AI secretaries or assistants in any way they can to cut costs. And on one hand, I am all for technology. I love leaning into kind of like what's next, what's the newest and greatest, what can be more efficient. Even I use like ChatGPT sometimes just to like talk through certain content ideas or whatever it is here and there. But on the other hand, I think there's some downsides to AI. One, replacing jobs that people used to have, and the other, like, you're simply just not talking to a human. So I think in terms of these leasing offices that use the AI chatbots or whatever to, talk through initial questions or maybe set up apartment tour times, like days and times and things like that, when you're getting into the nitty-gritty and need specifics beyond the is a 2-bedroom apartment available in this time frame, if you're asking something specific like is there a walk-in shower, are there steps to get into the unit even though it's on the first floor, they have absolutely no idea what to do. So that's what kind of extended this process and made it harder for me, because a lot places would have been narrowed from my list, and I wouldn't have to actually like physically go to different apartment buildings or communities if I would have known beforehand what their accessibility was like. But because so many of the offices use automation and these AI assistants, it was pretty impossible to get any of the information I needed. And I would try calling like beforehand before I like physically went to go do the tours. A lot of them wouldn't answer. So again, it's like I see the value in it when it comes to just like checking off the typical things that a regular average person would probably ask when they're touring, like bedroom size or the amenities and things like that. But again, just like talking about needing to clarify accessibility, they had no information. And then the bot would be like, I'm gonna ask my colleague and they'll get back to you, and then no one ever did. So I think that is something hopefully maybe can be improved on in the future, because as I said before, I ended up having to go to way more places than I wanted to, just because I had to figure out accessibility and what was possible and what was not possible. So now that I'm done complaining about AI and how it made the process so much more challenging for me, I wanted to get into the types of places that I checked out, what worked for me, what didn't work for me, and what I am really hoping will end up being my next home, pending approval and, the financials and everything that I need to figure out before we get there. I still have some time before I need to actually apply and figure all of that out, but reflecting back, this has been kind of like an emotional journey. It's been frustrating, especially whenever I did go to a certain apartment community and realize that it wasn't accessible. That was really hard to deal with at times, just because it was kind of like that realization, like, other people do have it easier, like point blank period. It is easier for certain people to find a place to live because these things don't matter, you know, that I need to specifically look for. And I did have some like low points in that journey, just kind of like coping with that reality of things. And I have looked for places in the past. You know, I have been out of my parents' house since I was 18, and I've lived in a variety of different, you know, apartments, houses, and things like that. But you know, this has just been the first time that I'm taking so many things more seriously than I have in the past. There's been a lot of variables, and while I did have some lows in this process, I didn't want to necessarily record myself crying in the car because who wants to see that? Now that the process is for the most part wrapped up in terms of touring, I don't really think there's any more else I could do. Now I can kind of debrief about it all and what I'm thinking, so let's get into it. I went into this process with a certain budget in mind, and then in terms of the place I wanted, I was really hoping for a 2-bedroom with at least 1 walk-in shower and on the ground floor because I can't do stairs. After touring some of those initial places, I realized that it's not the vibe I was going for anymore, because right now, currently, I live on the first floor and I don't have any issues, but just the more I think about it, being in Florida, there's tons of bugs and lizards and all these things that like can easily get into your apartment. And also it's just like safety wise, you know, if someone's walking by, they can, if I have my blinds open in the living room, they could see in, and little things like that. Just like the more I thought about it, I realized I don't want to be on the first floor. And to transition from being on the first floor, I needed to be somewhere where the buildings were big enough where there's elevators. So that's why I ended up touring so many, because I started out wanting one thing, and then as that went on, I completely shifted to what I was looking for. And a lot of the speed bumps that I dealt with at the beginning, especially looking in those types of communities, were whether or not they had first floors available, which some of them they don't. They could say online, oh, we have a 2-bedroom available, but you don't know till you're in and you see like timing wise when you need to start the lease, what you know, what they have available. And then if it's only on the 2nd, 3rd floor and there's no elevator, obviously that place has to get crossed off my list. Another aspect is I would get somewhere, and sometimes the leasing agents were amazing and helpful, sometimes they really were not, and that alone just like helped me determine and narrow down some places. But I would get to the unit that they wanted to show me to potentially move into, and there was like a step or two to get in, and you know, maybe that could have been fixed if I were to get like a temporary ramp installed where, you know, it's just easy for me to use my scooter or my walker getting in and out. But I just didn't even want to deal with that, especially if at the beginning they were telling me like, no, it's fine, and then I get there and it's not. And I just figured, you know, kind of like navigating around the community would inevitably end up being more challenging than I need it to be. So there are a handful of places that I wouldn't even know until I got there and went on the tour and realized that I can't even actually get into the unit without having some kind of modification. And with that, also, sometimes I would get to a place and they couldn't even bring me on a tour because the only units they had available for showing or their staged units were all on the 2nd or 3rd floor and required me to do stairs. And that just made the process super exhausting, to say the least. You know, I'd get there, I'd give them all my information, and then end up not even being able to go through with the tour. So that definitely took up a lot of time. Thankfully, one of my best friends is in real estate, so she joined me for one of the days of this, and it was really helpful just to have her insight while doing these tours, because on one hand, she knows me, she knows my accessibility needs, and on the other hand, she knows the real estate, you know, market and how these things work. So she actually helped me point out certain things in certain places that made them off my list. And one of those would be, you know, the unit itself in one of the apartment communities I liked. The unit was great, but as we were touring the amenities, which are super important to me because I am one of those people that if I'm living somewhere with amenities, I'm using them. I use the pool, I use the gym, I use the clubhouse, so it's important that I'm able to access them. And, you know, at first glance, doing this tour, all the amenities seemed awesome, they were great, and then my friend actually pointed out to me that the pool didn't have any railings to get into it. So she brought that to my attention. I didn't even notice just because this whole process was such a whirlwind for me. So when she said that, I brought it up to the attention of the leasing office, and I was just like, you know, if I do end up applying and moving here, is there a way to get rails installed so I can get in and out of the pool? Because otherwise I would have this pool that I can't even use. And they basically were like, we have to talk to our lawyers and talk to this person and get approval for this and this and that. And that also just made me take that off the list, because I'm like, if it's going to be this challenging just to get started with basic accessibility needs, then this probably, unfortunately, isn't the place for me. So there's tons of things that I had to consider this entire process, beyond just the actual unit, beyond just getting inside of the unit, you know, step-free, but also the amenities, safety. And I probably seemed like such a weirdo to some of these leasing agents giving me a tour, but I literally had to pretend I was getting in the bathtub for a lot of these units, because some of the bathtubs were super high. And you know I just did a whole video about showering with cerebral palsy and what my current setup is, and it is the best. I have to say I peaked. I've been spoiled having a walk-in, but it's really rare to find a walk-in, you know, especially in like a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom situation. So essentially I had to kind of like make that compromise that I'm gonna go back to using a tub. But of course, if I'm gonna have a tub, I need it to be safe, I need it to be low. Some of the heights of these tubs, I'm just like, how does the average person even get in here without hurting themselves? So that narrowed down some places. I had to physically make sure I can get into the tub, and then I also had to confirm with the places that if I did end up moving in there, I'd be able to get grab rails installed. So thankfully, once I narrowed it down, I found some tubs that were at good heights. I found buildings that I really liked. They had great amenities that were accessible. There were elevators in the buildings, and multiple elevators, so just in case anything were to ever go wrong with one of them, you know, I have other options that I can rely on. And of course, having like an emergency evacuation plan kind of like in the back of my head and sorted out with wherever I end up. And those were all super important things. So essentially I ended up changing the type of place I'm going to or want to go to, but now that the whole process is done, I learned a lot. I feel really good about my potential decision pending approval with the application and everything. And while I do have to compromise and not have a walk-in anymore, I think it's going to be totally fine getting back with a tub, installing grab rails, and just making the apartment as accessible as possible for my own needs. And I will say I do have more flexibility than someone who is a full-time wheelchair user, because when I am in my apartment, I do walk around independently. I do use scoots sometimes, let's say to like, you know, carry a big load of laundry to the washing machine or carry a hot bowl of soup. Like, I'm not gonna walk with that. So I do use my wheels sometimes, but day-to-day cooking and stuff like that, I'm standing, I'm walking around, and I do have that option. So in terms of accessibility, I didn't need to find like a fully wheelchair accessible place. I just needed to find something that was step-free, had enough space for my mobility accessories, you know, had a great bathroom setup, and yeah. So that's the tea on the process. It was very long and emotional 3 days, but I'm feeling much better now, and I am really excited and optimistic about this next part, you know, applying and getting all of that done. But I appreciate you guys for watching. I appreciate all of your kind words from my initial video from last week, sharing about this big change that I'm about to be going through, and I thank you for watching. So make sure you subscribe, like, comment, all the fun things, and we'll be back next with a moving vlog, maybe. We'll see.